Morning, everyone. So from an early age, from a very early age, as human beings, we determine that, uh, or I should say, we make a decision that we wish to seek an undisturbed state of mind, or an undisturbed state is probably a better way of putting it. And for a very young child, for a baby, that is because their survival depends on it. So as an infant, for instance, we can't survive without being fed. And then there's the slightly, maybe perhaps only slightly less tangible aspects of touch and affection and attention. And then we learn that if we don't get that if we complain loudly often, that all of a sudden that assistance comes to us rapidly in many instances, and all of a sudden we're not so disturbed because we're not hungry anymore, or we're being touched, being loved, whatever. So ultimately, of course, there's not only is there nothing wrong with this, but it's an essential part of survival at an early age. And with many things like this, many aspects of our early childhood development, when we become adults, the same methodology that we used as an infant or as a young child don't serve us that well, or certainly don't serve others very well, and often they don't serve us very well either. So early on, we make this decision. The decision we make is that we are to seek the undisturbed state. And the reason that we are constantly seeking this state is we believe that our inner state is dependent upon sensations and circumstances outside of our control. And this is this decision that sensations and circumstances are outside of our control, and that we're seeking an undisturbed state of mind and body. This is a very I'll say that it's a prescription for suffering, because life, as some of you have lived a little while, some of you have lived longer than me in this lifetime, some a little less, but probably everyone is determined at this point that life is not just about non-disturbance. So as Zen practitioners, as meditators, the problem, and this is a big problem, I'll say, and the reason I say it's a big problem is not just because of my own viewpoint, but it's written about extensively in the ancient literature, is that we bring that same mindset to our meditation. And so what we're essentially seeking initially from meditation is normally an undisturbed state. Why? Because number one, we've been told that that's what happens when we meditate. And number two, we've probably experienced, at least at times, an undisturbed state when we're meditating. And it's a very powerful elixir, the undisturbed state, the state of quietude, of non-disturbance, of our suffering, a feeling that our suffering is being released in our, whether it's in our meditation or afterwards. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. If it is something that is happening, it's the reality for us in that moment. There's nothing wrong with that. The issue is the seeking of the undisturbed state. So again, most of us Correct me if I'm wrong during the comment section. But most of us, when we begin meditating, it's because things aren't working well. We're feeling a lot of disturbance. We're suffering a lot, and maybe we read some Zen or Buddhism. And what did the Buddha teach that Buddhism is about? Well, he didn't call it Buddhism, number one, but people later did. But what the Buddha taught, what he was teaching, his teaching was about, I should say, was freeing beings from suffering, freeing sentient beings from suffering. It's very difficult to do that, to help others free themselves from suffering, if we're in a state of continual suffering, by the way. So this decision that that outside circumstances govern our inner state of being, we're not satisfied unless we've created the environment that's exactly what then results in non-disturbance for us, or seeming non-disturbance. And the chasing of the non-disturbance through our environmental factors, or other people even, or relationships, or substances, or anything else. It doesn't matter what it is. As long as we're relying on outside circumstances, outside sensations, outside objects, outside people, outside meaning outside of myself, of this particular skin bag, as it's called sometimes in ancient Buddhism. Not the most kind term, but it's true to a certain extent. As long as we're seeking that non-disturbance from something outside, we're eventually going to be disappointed. We will be disappointed. It's not a matter of if we're going to be disappointed, it's a matter of will be. And I'm sure, as I say, all of you have experienced that. So bringing that mindset to Zen, for instance, maybe in the beginning, it's not such a bad thing, because people do seek that non-disturbance in an inner way, instead of looking at non-disturbance through drinking a lot or drugs or something like that, or any particular addiction we have. And we're all addicted to something or another, to some degree or another. That we bring that same attitude into our meditation is probably not so bad at the very beginning, but quickly we find out that the more that we chase that experience of non-disturbance in an inner sense, the less it seems to be available to us. So it's as if, I'm saying as if somewhat rhetorically, but it's as if when we chase it, it goes away further. There is quite a bit of teaching about this. So I'm going to read one particular little nice poem on this by Master Hongji. Here's what he says about that. And I love the poetic way he states it. He says, "A beam of wondrous light spans past and present, shining through being and non-being, transcending all discrimination. Grasp at it directly and you miss it completely." Grasp at it directly and you miss it completely. But we're so conditioned to grasp at it directly. I mean, when we start out and we're suffering, or even if we're not starting out, maybe we've been doing this a while, but we're still suffering, at least at times, or maybe we aren't suffering that much, then all of a sudden something in our life comes along and a giant button gets pushed, the big red button, all of a sudden, all of our composure, all of our equanimity that we thought we had goes out the window, and all of a sudden we're suffering again, maybe feeling like even worse than before, because not only are we suffering, but we're thinking, oh, I've been doing this for so long. How come I'm still suffering? Why am I still suffering if I've been doing this so long? Have you ever said that to yourself? I know I have. So there's that part of us that's still chasing that undisturbed state. And so when we don't experience the undisturbed state, then we start feeling that something's wrong. And often what'll happen, I feel, I know it happened to me, maybe it still happens to some degree, I'm not sure, but much less than it used to. We do a little bypassing trick, that term spiritual bypassing, and that we get so into this wonderful sensation and feeling of release, of non-disturbance, uh, that we start ignoring everything else in our psyche or everything else in our life that's running counter to that. Sometimes it's a big glaring red light flashing, and yet we're not seeing it because we're spending our time in this undifferentiated state all the time of where suffering is gone for at least a time period. So the very thing that starts us out in the practice in most instances is then that which gets in the way later. This is true of a lot of things, probably. When we start out, we have a certain motivation because our mind is perhaps in chaos and we're trying to get a handle on it. And we're taught that you can through this practice, and you can in a certain sense. But the interesting thing is that you don't get a handle on it by attempting to control it, because then what part of us is attempting to control? It's the same part that's attempting to control things all the time, which is often what gets us into trouble in the first place. That part that's always wanting to be in control. And the problem with always wanting to be in control isn't that we can't sometimes be in control, at least of some things, but that part doesn't rest with that. It wants to be in control of everything all the time, essentially. So it's kind of, we have to admit to ourselves a few things. We have to admit to ourselves that the control part of ourselves wants to be in control all the time. When I say we have to, I mean, well, you don't really have to, but it's really valuable if we can. We can see that we want to control all the time, and that we've made this decision that the reason we want to be in control all the time is because our inner state is dependent upon outside things. And so if our inner state's dependent upon outside things, then there's this constant need to control the outside things that are running contrary to our non-disturbance. And if we apply the same logic, you want to call it logic, I think it is kind of logical in a sense. We apply the same logic to our meditation and our inner state that we experience, which is essentially our mind state. When we say mind state in Zen, we don't mean just the intellectual mind, we mean the body mind. So our mind state, we apply that to our mind state, then we're constantly cycling through suffering, release from it, suffering, release from it, suffering, release from it, and chasing the release from it. All because we have this idea that we should be non-disturbed, that there should be this non-disturbed state, and that it comes from outside of ourselves, or even inside of ourselves for that matter. It doesn't really matter at a certain point. As long as we're chasing it, then, like Hongji said, the more we chase it, the further it goes away from us. There's a few Zen koans and poems that speak to this issue. The ordinary mind is the way. And then, the monk asks him, well, if the ordinary mind is the way, then how, essentially, how do I approach it? And the master says, well, you approach it by not approaching it. The more you try to approach it, the further away it goes. So, again, this is not easy to do. it's something that does take practice for most people, a lot of practice. And it crops up in different ways at different times throughout our uh, meditation career, you might say. And because it kind of runs contrary to our most ancient conditioning, our conditioning as an infant, as a young child, and it kind of runs contrary, well, does run contrary to our basic deep biological conditioning, which is to move away from something that's painful or uncomfortable. Even insects run away from us when we try and bite us anyway, when they're threatened. Certainly mammals all do, but even more basic life forms, there's this self-preservation instinct. It's natural. And so the problem with that is when we're dealing with inner psychological issues, which we are, or psycho-spiritual issues, as I like to call them, because I'm not sure what the difference is or where the one ends and the other begins. When we're dealing with those things, the existential crisis that an actual fight or flight syndrome was biologically designed into our bodies and minds to deal with isn't really there. A psychological issue is not the same as a saber-toothed tiger chasing us. It may feel like that. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it isn't. It isn't actually a life or death. If you let the saber-toothed tiger get you, you're dead. But if it's a conflict you're having with a worker or a family member or a spouse or whatever, it's not going to kill you. It may feel like that, but that's the delusion that we've boxed ourselves into. So we're running against this childhood conditioning and this deep biological conditioning that we're talking about, millions and millions of years of that. And it's why this particular teaching of turning the mind to face things rather than running from them or fighting them. In other words, resisting or fighting. I mean, resisting or avoiding, fighting or avoiding. There is what's called the middle way, which doesn't involve fighting and doesn't involve avoiding, which is experiencing and moving through deeply experiencing and clearly seeing through our experience what the reality is there. And so the suffering is alleviated when we see how we, not outside circumstances, but we are resisting or creating suffering in some form or another. And this is key and essential to Zen. And it is key to truly experiencing freedom from suffering in a certain sense, but not maybe the sense that the ego, the controlling part of the ego, was seeking initially, which is to control things and freedom that way. But rather the freedom is the freedom to feel, and the freedom to experience. Freedom to feel sounds like, what do you even mean by freedom to feel? Well, I feel stuff every day, but do we really allow ourselves to deeply go into it when that big red button is pushed? The big issues in our life, the pandemic, life, death, love, all that kind of stuff, attachment, big issues, not, what color my new car is going to be or something like that. That's not an existential threat one way or the other. So the big issues require kind of a big response. And sometimes we think we've got all that taken care of after 3 or 5 or 10 or 40 or 50 years of practice, and then something comes along and a big red button that we didn't even see that big red button, but the right circumstance arises, or the right person or the right situation, and that button gets pushed, and oh my God, Has all this been for nothing? All this practice I've done, all this time, all this meditation? Well, that's a good question. That's what we have to allow ourselves to go into. No matter how many years or how many days or how many hours we've been doing this. I know there's some pretty new people maybe in this group. It doesn't matter the amount of time. It's a matter of, are we willing to allow ourselves to doubt and go deeply into the doubt? Deeply into the doubt means allowing ourselves to really feel it. When someone tells me they don't have any doubt, I don't care how many years they've been doing anything, I'm always suspicious of that. When someone presents themselves as a person without any doubt, and maybe there are some gurus somewhere, or I don't know, some kind of masters that don't have any doubt. But I would have to spend a few months with them in some trying circumstances and see, do they really not have any doubt? Not any? What is there to work with then? Disturbance gives us a place to work and a way to become more free. Disturbance and doubt is the avenue that we travel in order to move deeper. Does that mean I'm promoting disturbance? No, I'm not promoting disturbance. It's not like I'm out there particularly looking for it, but guess what? It arrives sooner or later in the form of a financial crisis, a health crisis, an existential crisis of some sort, some kind of dark night of the soul, perhaps. Even though we don't really talk about souls in Zen, but you know what I mean. So let's open it up in case anyone has any comments or questions. I want to make a little comment myself about what I've seen lately as a falling off of discussion on the Sunday group. And I just want to say,